Hi everyone, my name is Jacob Kashiwagi. I am a senior researcher at the Performance-Based Studies Research Group, presenting the paper, The Application of the Best Value Approach in Janitorial Services. This research was originally initiated by a city that was looking for a procurement and project delivery model that could help them be able to outsource services that they didn't have a lot of experience in, that they were performing in-house previously. They were also dealing with limited budget and very high stakeholder expectations. So they were looking for a more efficient process that could get better services for a lower cost. They heard about the Performance-Based Studies Research Group and about the best value approach, the project delivery model that we have been testing out throughout the world, especially through CIB W117, which goal is to use the best value approach and to see the value and the efficiency it can add to a service or project all over the world. And so you can see the performance that we've done and the different organizations that we've partnered with to do this. But what the city really bought into was the idea between a client-centric approach versus a vendor-centric. The city traditionally was doing a client-centric approach. This client-centric approach requires the client to be responsible for all the major areas of a project. So the client's the one making the decisions. The client is the one that needs to have the information expertise to make the requirements for a service. As well as a service moves on, the client is the one that will be responsible for the project management and risk management of the project. A vendor-centric approach is very simple. It's when the client recognizes they might not have the expertise, and thus they require the vendors to be responsible for all the major areas of a project. Thus, the vendors are making the decisions. The vendors are differentiating themselves, so the client doesn't have to worry about it and doesn't have to have that expertise. And so they wanted to try a test project. How the best value approach does this is basically it simplifies the project delivery model. So when they're making the RFP or they're trying to get vendors to bid for these services, they don't need to know anything. They just put down what currently they're doing or what they think they need, and they tell the vendors, it's your responsibility to actually determine how we're going to do this and what the requirements should be. Now, in order to select these vendors, they simply tell the vendors, we want to know in simple performance metrics what makes you different than other vendors. And you can see the criteria. They ask them to turn this in multiple ways, in their expertise, in their ability to minimize risk, and in the value added things that they can give to that project or service, plus to turn in their cost. And so once they turn all these things in, it becomes very apparent which vendor is the best for the service, and they let that vendor come into the clarification to actually lay out the entire plan for a service, what's going to be expected, how they're going to measure the performance of the service, and what should be done throughout the entire service. And so the City of Longmont wanted to do this. The contract they're going to do it on is their janitorial services for their 19 facilities. And so you can see the requirements that they put down. This is not really the requirements, this is what they currently were doing. This was very easy to do for them, so this RFP was done very quickly. And these are the criteria again. You can see the major weighting was on their ability to perform or their expertise, as well as on the interview, making sure the person who's managing the project understands what they're doing and can explain it very simply. And so here is the evaluation matrix, and you can see all the criteria were evaluated on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. The evaluation was very easy because if they turned in a document and it had performance metrics and was understandable, it received a 10. If they couldn't understand it, they didn't know what was going on, it was a 5, and if it was very low performing and they didn't think they could do the work, it was a 1. When you look at this, it became very clear there's only 2 vendors that have the performance capability to deliver this service. And when they looked at it, their performance numbers were very similar and the ratings were very similar. So they went to the cost and they found out that one vendor was half the cost. In fact, the highest evaluated vendor was half the cost of the other vendor, who was actually the incumbent. And so there was no choice for them. They went with the highest ranked vendor, and they brought them in. As they brought them in, they looked at their level of expertise. They looked at what they put down, which was they had done similar cities. They had expertise in hiring and training staff, as well as ensuring that any issues was dealt with to high quality and to the customer satisfaction. With the risks, they identified all the risks the city was worried about, which was we're going through the pandemic at that time, so they worried about their supply shortages, the different type of disinfecting services they had, as well as their turnover rate, making sure they had enough employees. They also required this vendor to turn in their documentation on anything they said. So here's the documentation on the 3 other cities and their comparison to the city that was buying their services. And then, of course, they require them to prove their low turnover rate, as well as being able to respond to issues in 24 hours and 100% satisfaction of the clients. They were able to explain what their numbers were, as well as turn in the forms and the documentation for it. Then they came into the clarification, and in the clarification, this is where they require the vendor to lay everything out. And you can see the vendor identified, look, these are all the things that we're going to do. This is how we're going to measure it. This is the frequency we're going to measure it. And they even put the requirement for that area on what was acceptable, what would be considered high performing or not passing. So you can kind of see that on the screen. They went through explaining in terms of their documentation of it. This is how we're going to document it. This is how we're going to show customer satisfaction, even down to the level of each building and how they would document every complaint. So you can see the results. In comparison with the process the city was doing before, you can see the best value vendor-centric approach had much higher ratings and provided much greater value and satisfaction. And you can see the efficiency of it in terms of how many pages the RFP scope of work had to be, as well as how much effort the client had to put in to finding this vendor and the time it took to procure them. And you can see not only did they get a high-performing vendor, but they also were able to reduce their costs almost by half with this vendor's proposal. And everybody was very satisfied. Now, unfortunately, because it was a COVID pandemic, they weren't able to go through with this contract. The higher-ups of the city, right when they were about to sign, said they no longer needed the janitorial services like they expected. And so this did not go through, and we can't give you an update on the performance of how they did. But it shows just by the clarification and the layout of their plan, just how effective a vendor-centric approach can be. I'll be available for any questions. Thank you so much. You have a great day.